During the early 1800s, Americans started looking west for new lands. These maps display how the densities changed in only a decade. In 1810, almost no one was living in the Alabama and Mississippi area. In 1820, there was already a good amount of people in those areas. Unfortunately, living in those areas were the Native Americans. The Native Americans consisted of 5 main tribes: the Chickasaws, Cherokees, Choctaws, Seminoles, and Creeks. These tribes, known as the 5 civilized tribes, attempted to appear civilized to the whites in order to not have their land taken. Many Native Americans started to learn the practice of farming and even had slaves. The Cherokee Sequoyah made a written language for his people, and they created a constitutional democratic republic. Even though some saw their ways and pleaded that the Native Americans have started to become civilized, the whites simply wanted their land, and with Andrew Jackson being elected in 1829, it looked very likely that the Native Americans would have to go. Although many opposed the Native Americans, they were not without their supporters. The previous president, John Quincy Adams, had many policies that protected the Native Americans. Some Whigs supported the Native Americans, as well as the Attorney General William Wirt, who defended them in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court Justice John Marshall ruled in favor of them, but his rulings were largely disregarded by Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson attempted to seem benevolent in his efforts towards the Indians. He claimed that if they moved west, they would have good land and be far away from the whites interfering with their lives. This argument, showing Jackson's message to Congress, shows his arguments that the Native Americans would be saved by moving out west. This document shows Jackson's argument to Congress that the Indian Removal Act would be mutually beneficial to the states and Indians. The states would be able to allow their populations to claim the Indians' land and grow on wealth, while the natives would be able to move out west untouched from white harassment. Jackson's argument made him seem like he cared for the Indians, like displayed in this picture. However, he cared very little for the Indians and wanted the states to be able to claim the land they wanted. Unfortunately for the Indians, many of their supporters also agreed with President Jackson, which worsened their case for staying in their homelands. Chief John Ross, however, completely unravels Jackson's facade with his letter to Congress saying that their problems will definitely not be solved by the Removal Act, which proposed that Native American tribes occupying areas wanted by settlers be moved to lands west of the Mississippi, mainly in the state of Oklahoma, and mocks the idea of the disenfranchisement of their land as a treaty. The Indians, seeing the injustice of the act, turned to the federal court for help. In the Worcester v. Georgia case, some missionaries to the Cherokee Nation caused a lawsuit regarding Georgia's law disallowing white men to settle on native land without state permits. The law, seeming to be a law benefiting the Cherokees, actually undermined the ability for the Cherokees to regulate and manage their own land. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where John Marshall ruled that the Cherokees have a relationship to the U.S. equivalent to 2 nations. This was monumental for the Indians, since Indians could lay claim and rights to their land, but President Jackson disregarded the decision and went through with his plans. This document displays the path the case took to the Supreme Court, with 2 previous decisions being ruled against the missionaries. This document displays the enforcement of the march to the new lands, forcing the Cherokees to hastily leave their new lands without preparation, despite the president's claim of goodwill. The resulting march, infamously known as the Trail of Tears, was a devastating march of the Cherokee Nation in 1838 to 1839. The marches were badly regulated, and many died due to illness, and the very weak Cherokees, such as infants, children, and elderly, were forced to march at gunpoint, many of which died. In March 1839, all of the migrants had arrived at their new lands, which were dry, arid, and overall terrible for farming and growing food. By that time, an estimated 1/5 of the population had died, devastating the nation. Due to ambitions of settlers and disregardment of Supreme Court decisions and view on Indian people as a whole, President Jackson initiated a devastating act upon the Indians that stripped them of their land and many of their people.